I'm going to talk about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. Negotiations have been underway on an agreement between the European Union and the United States for more than 2 years now to create this partnership, which is a free trade agreement between the EU and the United States. These two areas are very important, of course, globally. They collectively account for about 60% of world GDP, a very large proportion. They account for about a third of the trade in goods, manufactured goods, agricultural products, and about 40% of the trade in services. It's a very large area. If you put the two together, we're talking about a market size of more than 800 million people. So this is a very significant economic bloc. The negotiations on the trade and investment relationships between the EU and the US take place in a context in which these relationships are already very significant. The EU has a trade surplus of over 100 billion euros with the United States. It has a surplus which is much smaller in agricultural products, but nevertheless quite significant. It's about 6 billion euros. And much of that surplus is in value-added commodities, food and beverages. There's also a substantial flow of investment between the European Union and the United States. The US is the leading destination for outward investment from the European Union. And the US is the largest source of foreign investment in the EU. All told, it's estimated that roughly 13 million jobs in both the United States and the European Union are supported by EU-US trade and investment. So there's already a very important economic relationship. So the question would be, well, why do we need a free trade agreement? Well, the first reason, obviously, is that there are tariffs on goods traded between the European Union and the United States. In general, the tariffs on many products are quite low. Manufactured goods, for example, are quite low. In agriculture, the averages are higher. For trade between the United States and Europe, the average tariff is around about 7%. In the other direction, in other words, trade between the EU and between the US and the EU, it's about 13%. But within that context, there are some products which are heavily protected. They're subject to high tariffs. On the US side, one set of commodities that's particularly interesting for Europe that's heavily protected is dairy products. And that's a major part of exports from the EU. As far as the United States is concerned, the major products that are most heavily protected in Europe are meat and the meat category, and that's of interest to the United States. The other thing is that while there are some high tariffs on these products, trade is also limited by what is known as tariff rate quotas. These fix quantities of imports which are allowed at low tariffs, but once that quantity of imports is reached, then additional imports are subject to very high tariffs. And that obviously discourages significant amounts of additional trade, for example, in dairy products between the EU and the US, and in meat between the US and the EU. Another issue that's getting a lot of attention in the negotiations is regulations and regulatory barriers. These are actually probably at least as important, if not more important, than tariffs and the tariff rate quotas in affecting agricultural trade. What are we talking about here? We're talking about things like customs procedures, which are very important, particularly when you're dealing with perishable products. We're dealing with regulations governing sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, which are very significant for food and agricultural products. So those regulatory barriers are also going to be a part, or indeed are a part, of the negotiations on TTIP. Let me say a little bit about what the aims are of the two groups here, the EU and the US, in these negotiations. As far as both of them are concerned, they would like to reduce or eliminate a lot of the tariffs that are on agricultural products and products in general. Recently, the EU negotiated a free trade agreement with Canada, and if we look at that agreement, we can see that more than 90% of the tariffs on agricultural products are going to be reduced or eliminated, eventually eliminated. There are some exceptions for sensitive products. So, for example, tariffs will not be eliminated completely on dairy or on beef. But for those products, what will happen is that the quotas, under the tariff rate quotas, will be increased so that Canada can have increased access to the EU market and the EU can have increased access to the Canadian market. Also, in terms of objectives, both countries, both regions are interested in streamlining and simplifying customs procedures. These add significantly to trade costs, and if we can streamline those, firms will be able to export more easily and at lower cost between the two areas. What are some of the other objectives? Well, as far as the United States is concerned, there's particular focus on trying to get a reduction or clarification in some regulatory barriers that affect trade. The particular area here that is of interest to the United States is the sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions. The US wants those restrictions to be based purely on scientific criteria, whereas in Europe there is a mixture of objectives that result in restrictions being based more on consumer preferences or public attitudes to goods, and the United States would like some progress in clarifying that. In terms of the European Union, one of the major objectives here would be to obtain a broader recognition for products which are distinguished by their geographical origin. These are very important in Europe, and in the United States, many products which would be protected under their geographical names do not have that protection, and Europe would like to see that given. So what are the key problems in reaching an agreement? First one would be the sensitive products. Countries are reluctant to open up their markets completely, for example, in the United States to dairy products, in the EU to meat. So it's going to be difficult to reach an agreement on those sensitive products. The regulations, that's going to be another area where there's going to be a lot of discussion. In Europe, for example, people are worried about whether or not they'll be able to limit the access of products based on production methods. For example, in the United States, we often use growth hormones to promote meat production. We're also very heavily into genetically modified products, and there are concerns about how those might be regulated in future in the EU. A third issue that I haven't mentioned, but it's very significant, is that it is proposed to have a dispute settlement procedure in the agreement. In other words, that if there are complaints about the way that the agreement is being implemented, that will be accessible to companies rather than to states. So in other words, if a firm says the EU isn't meeting its obligations under the agreement, they can actually bring a complaint before a tribunal, and they can obtain redress if the tribunal rules that the EU is not following its obligations. Now, there's a lot of concern about that, particularly in Europe, because the Europeans think that perhaps this will be used to pry open the European market to genetically modified foods or other things. Interestingly enough, this type of provision applies in a lot of trade agreements, including many of those that are enforced between the EU and other countries. And in fact, EU companies are the leading user of this mechanism in other trade agreements. So it's somewhat paradoxical that that's the major concern, when in fact EU companies are heavy users of that type of provision in other trade agreements. So finally, let me finish up by talking about the prospects for firms, particularly agricultural firms, if we manage to reach an agreement under the negotiations. Well, the first thing, of course, is that we'll have broader market access, lower trade costs. I think that's particularly important for smaller companies, smaller and medium-sized enterprises find these regulations that they face in trade quite burdensome. So simplifying those will be of particular benefit to smaller and medium-sized companies. Second thing, of course, is there will be more competition. But on the other hand, there will be more opportunity, I think, to develop markets, particularly in value-added products. So, for example, in products that are distinguished by place of production in the EU, in the US market. And finally, the agreement will definitely give a stimulus to investment. Investment flows, as I've said, are large already between the two entities, but they'll probably increase. There's a tremendous amount of investment going on in the agro-food area at the moment, involving both the United States and the European Union. For example, the EU firms are making a major presence in food retailing in the United States at the moment, and we can expect that sort of development to continue if the agreement is concluded successfully.